After it happened, you remembered. The moment something was different. The sentence that did not fit. The look that lasted 1 second less than it should have. The signs were there. You just did not know what you were looking at. Every betrayal has a prehistory. It does not begin when the knife goes in. It begins weeks, months, sometimes years before, in small behavioral deviations that, in isolation, seem insignificant, but that, seen together, form a pattern that was available to be read, that you did not read, not because you are naive, not because you are weak, not because you are less intelligent than the one who betrayed you, but because no one taught you what to look for. The title of this video says, 5 seconds before. But the truth is more disturbing than that. The signs are usually available 5 weeks before. 5 months before. The 5 seconds are just the moment when you finally allow what you already knew to become conscious. There is something psychologists call peripheral knowledge, information the nervous system collected and processed. But the conscious mind did not integrate because integrating would be too painful. You knew. Not completely, not articulately, but you knew. And that suppressed knowing, that perception buried because facing what it meant would cost too much, is exactly what this video will bring to the surface. To recognize a traitor, you first need to understand what a traitor is. And the answer is more complex and more disturbing than the simple version most people prefer, the simple version. The traitor is a monster, fundamentally different from you, without conscience, without empathy. That version is comforting and almost always wrong. Most betrayals do not come from monsters. They come from ordinary people operating under a specific combination of conditions. Psychologist Dan Ariely at Duke University spent decades studying human dishonesty. His central conclusion: dishonesty is not a personality, characteristic of a minority. It is a spectrum on which most people behave dishonestly when the right conditions are present. The 3 conditions that produce betrayal. Condition 1. Threatened or unmet self-interest. Betrayal rarely happens when someone is satisfied. It happens when someone feels, real or imagined, that they are not getting what they deserve, that they are being overlooked, that their position is threatened. Corporate betrayal that happens when someone feels they will be fired and leaks information to a competitor first. Relational betrayal that happens when someone feels undervalued and seeks validation elsewhere. Friendship betrayal that happens when someone feels you advanced and they stayed behind. Betrayal does not begin with the action. It begins with unspoken resentment. Condition 2. Available moral justification. Albert Bandura. People do not see themselves as traitors. Those who betray almost invariably constructed a narrative that frames the betrayal as fair, necessary, or inevitable. They deserved it. I did more than they ever acknowledged. It was either them or me. Anyone in my position would have done the same. Psychologist Albert Bandura called this mechanism moral disengagement, the human capacity to deactivate one's own ethical standards through cognitive justifications. The traitor does not wake up thinking, I am going to do something terrible. They wake up thinking, finally, I am going to do what is fair. And this inversion, from crime to justice, is what makes betrayal so hard to detect, because the person building the justification does not look like someone planning something. They look like someone solving a problem. Condition 3. Opportunity with low perceived risk. Betrayal rarely happens when the risk of discovery is high. It happens when someone calculates, consciously or not, that they can act without serious consequences. The traitor does not betray because they are brave. They betray because they calculated it was safe. And the calculation that produced that conclusion, the process by which someone decided betrayal, was more advantageous than loyalty. That process has observable signs. Relational patterns. John Gottman. Researcher John Gottman, who spent 40 years studying relationships, made a central distinction: the distinction between gradual erosion and sudden rupture. Betrayals that seem sudden, that arrive without warning, that shock by their apparent impossibility. are rarely truly sudden. They are the endpoint of an erosion process that happened in slow motion. Below the threshold of conscious perception, Gottman identified specific patterns that precede relational ruptures. Behaviors that, when present and repeated, are reliable predictors that something is disintegrating. Not proof. Predictors. Proof is what you present after. Predictor is what you observe before. Example: the executive and the colleague. An executive works with a colleague for 3 years. They build an important project together. She trusts him with strategic company information. He presents that information to leadership as if it were his. She is excluded from the resulting promotion. When she looks back after the betrayal, she realizes, in the 6 months prior, he had started asking more specific questions about the details she controlled. Stopped sharing information with her in the same proportion as before. Started attending meetings with leadership that were previously irrelevant to his role. Began subtly minimizing her contributions in conversations with other colleagues. None of these signs, in isolation, was proof of anything, but together, seen as a sequence, not as incidents, they were the map of someone in the process of moral disengagement and preparation to act. She was not being naive. She was evaluating each incident in isolation instead of seeing the pattern.
It wasn't just one incident. He was preparing to act, asking for details, hoarding information, minimizing my role to leadership. I just missed the pattern.
Machiavelli wrote something most people read as cynicism and few read as protection. Men in general judge more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see but few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few perceive what you really are. He was not describing how to manipulate. He was describing how people operate. And the practical implication is this: the appearance of loyalty and real loyalty are different things. And confusing the two, accepting the performance of loyalty as evidence of real loyalty, is the condition that makes betrayal possible. Julius Caesar, interest-based versus affection-based trust. The great strategists of history were not distrustful by dark nature. They were precise by practical necessity. Julius Caesar, who was literally stabbed by people he trusted, wrote in his commentaries that the leader's error is not trusting. It is trusting without verifying. He clearly distinguished between two categories of allies: those loyal by aligned interest, whose success depended on Caesar's success, and those loyal by affection, whose alignment was emotional, and therefore subject to change when affection changed. Caesar trusted both, but managed the risks differently. To those loyal by interest, he gave strategic information. To those loyal by affection, he gave presence and recognition, but not information that, if leaked, would cost position. Robert Greene, Law 2. Robert Greene, in the 48 Laws of Power, dedicated an entire law to this. Law 2. Never put too much trust in friends. Learn how to use enemies. Greene observed that friends, because the relationship is based on affection, have more difficulty being honest about failures, maintaining separation between personal interest and loyalty. The point is not to distrust friends. It is to understand that intimacy is not a guarantee of loyalty, and that frequently, as data on betrayal confirms, the most devastating betrayals come from those closest. Not because proximity causes betrayal, but because proximity creates access. And access, in the presence of the three conditions, is what makes betrayal possible. The calibrated trust model. Machiavelli was not preaching isolation or cynicism. He was preaching something more sophisticated: trust proportional to evidence. In practical terms, this means 3 things. First, what you share should be proportional to the history of how the other person treated previous information, not how much you like them, not how much they demonstrate affection for you, to the history of behavior. Second, loyalty under pressure is the only loyalty that counts. Anyone is loyal when it is easy to be loyal. Real loyalty appears when being loyal has a cost. When the other could benefit from your position being exposed. When defending you is inconvenient. Those who were loyal under pressure in the past have a history of real loyalty. Those who were loyal only when it was convenient have a history of convenience. Third, observe what people do with information about third parties. How someone treats the vulnerabilities, secrets, and weaknesses of other people when talking to you is exactly how they will treat yours when talking to others. The person who easily shares intimate details about friends is not just gossipy. They are someone who has no boundaries between what belongs to others and what belongs to themselves. And what has no boundaries for others will have no boundaries for you.
A new manager takes over.
The team climate is positive, we are on track.
Sarah failed her last project. She is very vulnerable.
This section will be hard to hear, not because it will blame you for the betrayal you suffered. You are not responsible for another's choice to betray, but because it will name something most analyses of betrayal avoid. The role your own psychology played in creating conditions for betrayal to happen, not as cause, as context, and understanding that context, with honesty, without self-punishment, is what will change the pattern. Dimension 1. The compulsive loyalist. There is a specific psychological profile disproportionately betrayed, not the naive, who trust because they do not know the world. The compulsive loyalist, who trust because trusting is part of how they define themselves. The person who has loyalty as a core value often extends that loyalty to others as projection. I would never do that, so people close to me would never do that either. This is not naivety. It is a specific cognitive distortion psychologists call asymmetric similarity bias, the tendency to assume others share your core values when there is no evidence they do. Those who are fundamentally honest have more difficulty detecting dishonesty. Those who are fundamentally loyal have more difficulty detecting disloyalty, not by lack of intelligence, by excess of identification with their own value. Dimension 2. Motivated distortion. Timothy Wilson, there is a second reason signs are ignored, more painful than the first. The desire for the person to be who you need them to be. Psychologist Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia calls this motivated distortion, the tendency to interpret ambiguous information consistently with what we want to be true. And the greater the investment in the bond, the more you need that person to be who you believe they are, the more intense the distortion. You were not being naive, you were being human. And the difference between being human and being protected is developing the capacity to question reinterpretation when it appears. Dimension 3. The Jungian shadow. Jung identified something directly applicable to betrayal dynamics. The qualities we most admire in others, that most strongly attract us, that create the most intense bonds, are frequently qualities that exist in our own shadow. The person who suppressed their own assertiveness will be magnetically attracted to assertive people, and will interpret assertiveness as strength, even when it is disguised aggression. The person who suppressed their own ambition will be attracted to ambitious people, and will interpret ambition as vision, even when it is willingness to use others to advance. The person who suppressed their own capacity to act in self-interest will be attracted to people who demonstrate need, and will interpret need as genuine bond, even when it is instrumentalization. The betrayer often offers exactly what you needed to receive: validation, admiration, complicity, a sense of being special, because they learned that is the currency that opens your doors. Integrating this shadow does not mean becoming cold or calculating. It means developing enough self-awareness to recognize when you are being attracted by something that is a reflection of what you need, rather than evidence of who the other is. Dimension 4. Suppressed peripheral knowledge. Jennifer Fried. Researcher Jennifer Fried demonstrated something specific about how the nervous system handles signs of betrayal from people we depend on. When the potential source of betrayal is someone you depend on emotionally, someone whose loss would be devastating, the nervous system has a specific mechanism. It actively suppresses threat perception, not by naivety, by survival. because processing the threat would require either acting on it, which may cost the bond, or living with it consciously, which is unbearable. So the nervous system creates a third option: perceives and does not perceive simultaneously, registers and does not integrate, knows and does not know. This is the mechanism that explains why, after betrayals, people often clearly report the signs that were present. They were available. They just could not be consciously processed without a cost greater than the nervous system was willing to pay. And the protection against this mechanism is not suppressing the bond. It is developing enough internal security that processing the threat does not feel like threatening survival itself. Now, what most people came to this video for: the concrete signs, specific, observable, nameable, measurable micro-behaviors that precede betrayal with enough consistency to be used as data. One warning before we begin. None of these signs, in isolation, is proof of anything. One sign is a data point. Two signs from the same cluster are an emerging pattern. Three or more consistent signs over time are a map. You are not looking for a silver bullet. You are learning to read a language. Cluster 1. Changes in communication patterns. Communication behavior is one of the most reliable indicators of relational state, because it is where inconsistencies between what the person feels and what they present first appear. Signal 1.1. Reduced spontaneity. The person who used to message you without specific reason, who shared thoughts, jokes, information without you needing to initiate, starts responding only when you initiate. Not as a one-day mood change, as a pattern over weeks. Spontaneity in communication is an indicator of genuine investment in the bond. When it disappears, investment is being redirected. Signal 1.2. Sudden, excessive precision, casual, relaxed communication is replaced by communication that seems more measured. Shorter sentences, more punctual responses, less spontaneous revelation of internal state. When someone starts monitoring what they say to you, editing before sending, weighing every word, they are managing information. And information management in a close bond context is incompatible with genuine loyalty. Signal 1.3. Change in question quality. The person who used to ask how you were, demonstrating genuine interest in your internal state, starts asking more specific questions about what you know, what you plan, what your next moves are. The shift from "how are you" to "what are you going to do" seems subtle, but it is the difference between interest in the bond and intelligence collection. Cluster 2. Progressive public misalignment. There is a specific behavior that precedes relational and corporate betrayals with high consistency, rarely named because it is hard to articulate in the moment. Progressive public misalignment. The process by which someone gradually stops associating themselves with your position in public contexts before formally breaking or acting against you. Signal 2.1. Omission of credit in contexts where it was once automatic. The person who used to naturally include you, "It was our team's idea, John led this," starts presenting joint work as singular, not dramatically, subtly. 1 meeting, 2, 3. Each omission may have an explanation. The pattern of omission does not. Signal 2.2. Differentiated positioning in conflicts. When a conflict involving you arises, the person begins positioning themselves to maximize their own neutrality, not necessarily against you, but no longer clearly by your side. This growing neutrality in conflicts they previously navigated alongside you is an indicator they are building options. People building options are preparing for a future that does not include you in the same position. Signal 2.3. Approach to adversarial people. The person begins investing in relationships with individuals in conflict with you, who have an agenda opposed to yours, who would benefit from your vulnerability. Not as natural network expansion, as a specific pattern of approaching your opposition. This is the most advanced signal in the cluster. When present and consistent, preparation is already underway. Cluster 3. What the body says before the mouth. Psychologist Ekman, who spent decades studying facial expressions and body language, identified something directly applicable to reading disloyalty. True emotions produce involuntary expressions that precede and often contradict voluntary expressions. In plain language, the body reveals before the mouth decides what to say. Signal 3.1. Eye contact deflection at specific moments. Not general deflection. The person still makes normal eye contact. Deflection at specific moments. When you mention the project they are planning to present as theirs, when you express trust in them. Sustained eye contact requires congruence between what is being communicated and what is being felt. When there is incongruence, when what you are saying conflicts with what the person is planning, maintaining eye contact becomes neurologically more costly. The deflection is not proof. It is a data point. Signal 3.2. Micro-expressions of discomfort when receiving trust. When you express trust, share sensitive information, or demonstrate dependence, and the person is in the process of moral disengagement. There is often a micro-expression that precedes the verbal response. Ekman demonstrated that these micro-expressions, lasting between 1/5 and 1/25 of a second, are processed by the nervous system even when not consciously perceived. When you leave a conversation with the diffuse sense that something was slightly off, without being able to name what, it is often because your nervous system processed a micro-expression your conscious mind did not integrate. This is the 5 seconds of the title, not a single sign that appears immediately before. It is the moment your nervous system finally allows what you already knew to become conscious. Signal 3.3. Change in physical proximity pattern. The person who used to naturally approach starts maintaining subtle but consistent physical distance, not declared distance. A few extra centimeters. The nervous system of someone in the process of disengaging from a bond begins to create physical distance before creating declared distance, because the body processes internal state more honestly than conscious mind allows. The Trust Calibration Protocol, Level 1. Baseline before analysis. Before interpreting any behavior as a signal, you need a baseline, a clear record of the person's habitual behavior in different contexts. A deviation from baseline is data. A baseline you do not have makes any interpretation speculative. This means you cannot apply these filters to people you just met. You apply them to people whose behavioral pattern you already know, and observe changes relative to that pattern. Level 2. Cluster. Not incident. One isolated signal is not a pattern. You need at least 2 signals from the same cluster or different clusters before elevating attention level. And elevated attention is not action. It is more careful observation. The response to an emerging pattern is not immediate confrontation or total withdrawal. It is information management. You gradually reduce what you share while keeping the bond superficially stable. This serves 2 purposes: protects sensitive information before certainty, and creates space for the pattern to confirm or dissolve. Level 3. The loyalty test under pressure. When signals are sufficient to raise genuine concern, there is a way to test without confrontation. You share verifiable information, something you can track if passed along, with the specific person you are monitoring. Not a lie. Real but low-risk information if leaked, and that you have not shared with anyone else. If the information appears where it should not, if you hear it back through channels the person should not have fed, you have concrete data, not speculation, and concrete data allows concrete decisions, without drama, without confrontation that reveals you were observing, with the clarity of someone who knows what they are seeing. There is something that needs to be said before ending. Something all content on reading people, on psychological games, on strategic protection tends to omit, because it is less dramatic than the content, and more important than everything that was said. What this video really gave you. Knowing how to read signs of disloyalty will not protect you from all betrayal. Sophisticated people, who are deliberate in constructing false loyalty, who control micro-expressions, who manage their own public misalignment with precision, are hard to detect. So what did this video really give you? Not certainty, better calibration. The ability to adjust how much you invest in whom, based on observable evidence, instead of affection without anchoring. The ability to perceive when a bond is changing before being forced to process the change after a rupture. The ability to protect what needs protecting without needing to close what does not need closing. Calibration is not cynicism. The cynic closed down by generalizing. They treated everyone as potential betrayers because they were betrayed by someone. The calibrated person remains open, but directs openness proportionally to evidence. They connect genuinely. They trust genuinely. But they trust people who have demonstrated trustworthiness, not people who have demonstrated affection. Francis Bacon, knowledge is power. There is a distinction philosopher Francis Bacon made in the 17th century that has never lost precision. Knowledge is power. Not in the sense the phrase is often cited, as if knowledge were domination, in the original sense. Knowledge frees you from being governed by what you do not know. You are not betrayed by the betrayer. You are betrayed by the gap between what the betrayer is and what you believe they were. Reducing that gap, not eliminating it because it will never be zero, but reducing it through deliberate, calibrated observation is what knowledge of betrayal patterns offers. Not invulnerability, less surprise. And less surprise means less emotional, relational, and strategic cost when betrayals happen. Because you saw before being fully struck. The cost of seeing. I will be honest about what this knowledge will cost. Some bonds you have now, bonds that seem solid, that seem genuine, will look different when you start observing the patterns this video described. Not necessarily because they are ongoing betrayals, but because you will realize some were built more on mutual need than real loyalty. Some have asymmetries you had not named. Some depend on your willingness not to see what is visible. And that perception, necessary, useful, protective, will be painful. Not because you were deceived, because you were choosing not to see. And the end of that choice has a cost. Let us return to the beginning. After it happened, you remembered. The moment, something was different. The sentence that did not fit. The look that lasted 1 second less than it should have. Now you know the name of what you were seeing: progressive public misalignment. Chip chant in question quality. Eye contact deflection at specific moments, building options toward your opposition. You know what moves the betrayer: threatened interest, available justification, low perceived risk. You know what in you facilitated access and can work on that. You have a calibration protocol that does not close, but protects. What you do with this now is your choice. You can use it to examine current bonds with more calibrated eyes. Use it to understand past betrayals with less self-punishment and more clarity. Use it to build new bonds on foundations more solid than affection without anchoring. But there is one thing you can no longer do. Say you did not know what to look for. The signs were always there. Now you know how to read them. Subscribe. Not for more content. For the ability to see. Commandment. One pattern you are going to break. Share this with someone who needs to see the board. See you next.